autistic people played a central role in human invention. Even you are a nice example of individuals who think differently, want to try and understand how to improve a technology or a tool that they're using to make progress. That view of autism, that it's just part of the diversity of human beings, that we're not just all doing the same thing over and over again, but we're looking for new ways to do things, to optimize things. It kind of led to a shift in my perspective.
We've had such a great response to the podcast, and so many of you have been in touch asking what you can do to help. It's really simple. Just follow, subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. That way we can reach more people, and that way we can celebrate these great minds that think differently. Our next guest is one of the most influential figures in autism research. Sir Simon Baron-Cohen is a Cambridge professor, director of the Autism Research Centre, and a leading voice in the field for over 4 decades. Knighted for his contributions, he's published over 750 papers and developed key autism diagnostic tools that have shaped both the scientific and public understanding of autism. Although Simon's influence in the field is undeniable, his work has also sparked significant controversy, especially around biology, gender, and genetics. Just a heads up, we do discuss some difficult topics, including mental health and suicide. I've waited over a year to speak to Simon. He didn't disappoint. Let's get into it. Let's see how great minds think differently. Can you become autistic?
So my understanding of autism, and other people may have a different view, is that you're essentially born with it, and depending on the environment that you're in, the challenges may become more pronounced. So autistic people often seek out being in particular environments that they feel comfortable in, and maybe avoid other types of situations or environments that they would find very stressful. And it may be that, for example, where we see an increase in autism diagnosis in the transition from primary school to secondary school, where you've gone from a relatively small social group of maybe a few hundred kids to a secondary school of 800 or 900, suddenly a much bigger social world to navigate.
Yep.
It's under sort of different conditions that people might feel, I'm not coping, or parents might notice it, or teachers might notice it.
There's nothing associated with brain injury, for example, or any other potential trauma, for example, that in your experience and to your knowledge has then led to autistic traits?
No, exactly. So when you take the history, the developmental history of an autistic person, talking to the parents about what was your child like all the way through, it's not that like there was a single event, a bump on the head or an accident or some kind of brain injury where suddenly behavior changed. It's more that this was a child who was different all the way right from the beginning.
Yeah.
If you leave the child to just be themselves, then often they'll find what appeals to them. They'll do what they enjoy. But if you put them into a context where maybe they're expected to conform in a particular way, it could be that that's where the challenges start to arise.
In your work, over the course of 4 decades, what have you proven or understood that you've changed your mind on?
So in terms of what we've proven, I think when it comes to understanding the causes of autism, I talked earlier about our work into the hormonal element. And that took quite a long time. We started that work probably in the late 90s, but it wasn't until about 2014 that through quite sort of painstaking research, we were able to demonstrate that autism is associated with higher levels of testosterone and estrogen in the womb. So that's an example of, I guess, more biological type research. It has to be replicated, but there are other studies internationally that are pointing to that, the role of hormones in the causes of autism.
And what does that mean?
In terms of science, it's really just kind of helping us fill out part of the story of autism. How does autism arise and what causes someone to be autistic? It may have relevance to health, and it's something that we're interested to explore. So, for example, some of our work has found that women who have polycystic ovary syndrome, or PCOS, which is a hormonal condition, they're more likely to have an autistic child. And that's been found in 3 or 4 different big studies across different countries. So these are women who've got higher levels of hormones anyway, but it means that their baby's exposed to higher levels of these hormones during pregnancy.
Okay.
So, and then what we've found is that autistic girls and women themselves have a higher likelihood of this condition, PCOS, polycystic ovary syndrome.
So in autism specifically, PCOS over indexes.
Yeah, exactly. So that's an example where there might be differences in a person's hormone levels which cause a change in their health or in the way their bodies work.
Forget pregnancy for a second.
Yeah.
What do we know about autistic people's hormone levels?
Yeah, we don't know enough. And,
Okay.
so our work is going to continue in that area. We know that there are differences at the age in which autistic people go into puberty. So some of the studies show that autistic boys go into puberty early and autistic girls go into puberty slightly late compared to non-autistic kids of the same age.
Anything about perimenopause, menopause? I'm just thinking of key hormonal times in people's lives.
Hasn't really been looked at.
Okay.
So that's a gap in our knowledge.
Okay, let's add that to the list.
Yeah. So it's an example where you can look at, say, hormonal factors, either just to try to understand autism better, but it might also have some relevance to health.
Yes.
So that's kind of an example of things that we've discovered along the way, but where it opens up a whole bunch of new questions like the ones you just mentioned.
And then the second part of the question of what have you changed your mind on?
So I would say that in the first 20 years of my research and our research group, we were focused much more on disability and focused particularly on the social disability in autism. And so along with the field, really, I became unhappy that we were missing out on really focusing on autistic people's strengths. So we started bit by bit to try to find evidence for autistic people's strengths and publishing papers that demonstrate that or that report that. I'd say that led me to change my view of autism. In the early years, I would have spoken about what autistic children struggle with and what they can't do relative to the same age non-autistic child. It kind of led to a shift in my perspective.
Do you think that's why some people in the autistic community have a problem with some of your work?
Well, we've talked about some of the aspects of my work which might have been, controversial. So the work on genetics that we talked about, we held a big consultation to talk to autistic people and their families about whether this kind of research is wanted. And we found quite mixed views. Some people are very supportive of genetics research. Other people are very nervous about it. So we've shifted the work to look much more on the health aspects of autistic people.
Would you have done anything differently with that project?
Well, I think in that particular project, it involved collecting new DNA samples. As the science has progressed, there isn't really a need to do more DNA collection in autism. There's actually quite a lot of data that's already out there. And that I think where there's a greater need is to understand why autistic people have an increased risk of certain health conditions, both on the mental health side, depression and anxiety, but also on the physical health side. So we talked about epilepsy would be one example, gastrointestinal pain, really trying to understand why is that more common in autistic people. So kind of shifting the work more to look at that relationship between autism and their health.
Can you explain what mind blindness is?
So that was a term that I coined back in 1990. And it referred to autistic children's relative difficulty in imagining what someone else knows or believes or thinks. So back then, we were doing these little experiments, looking at whether a child, autistic or non-autistic, could imagine what someone might know or believe. And we found evidence that autistic kids had struggled in this area.
Why do you think autistic kids struggled in that area?
So it's a great question. I think that my understanding of autism, the way it's kind of deepened over the years, is that I think autistic people are more focused on the real world, the world of objects and the world of facts, and kind of less focused on what's going on in somebody else's mind. So their interests are just different. So whereas a non-autistic child might be tracking what is someone feeling and what is someone thinking right now. So they're imagining, even if someone else is mistaken in their beliefs, they're trying to keep track of what someone might believe or think. Autistic people are much more focused, I think, on the here and now and the facts of the situation.
River, my daughter, she's 5, and she's obsessed with whether something's fiction or non-fiction.
Okay.
That's very important to her.
Right.
To understand if something is real or made up. And I'm pretty literal, but she's also very literal.
Yeah.
And she wants to understand, well, what's the proof that you're a leading expert on autism?
Yeah. So she's interested in evidence.
Yes.
Just like scientists are, really.
Yes.
So maybe she's destined to be a scientist when she's older.
Why did some people not like the mind blindness idea, Simon?
I think the term suggests that an autistic person is completely blind to the state of mind of another person. And that would be an extreme example. There might be people like that. But as the concept of a spectrum grew in popularity, so did this idea that autistic people's disabilities might vary by degree. So you might have more or less difficulty in understanding or appreciating other people's state of mind. So it's not all or none, that you're either a mind reader or completely mind blind. Those would be two extremes. But actually there's levels of ability in this area. And the autistic people are just shifted more towards having difficulties in what we call mind reading, or just keeping track of what other people are thinking and feeling.
So do you think that the concept of mind blindness versus mind reader was too binary?
So, mind blindness taken to an extreme would be someone who only thought about their own perspective, never really considered other people's perspectives, only focused on what was true according to what they knew and the evidence they could find, rather than considering that other people might have different perspectives. It would pick out quite an extreme single perspective.
How do you personally deal with, you've published 750 plus papers, been knighted, you've received a tremendous amount of praise and accolade for all of the really important work that you've done. How do you process that personally when there's also backlash to your work?
So when you get criticism of your work, I would hope this is true for anyone, you listen to it and talk to people and find out what the concerns are, perhaps where their misunderstandings are. We talked a little bit about genetics, for example, earlier. I would say that was an example where there was quite a lot of misunderstanding. So before we started that research project, we were at pains to reassure autistic people that we were anti-eugenics. We weren't doing genetics research to develop a prenatal test, and yet those were exactly the fears that provoked concerns once the study was launched.
Was there anything that you could have done to improve that situation? How much were autistic people's voices consulted pre?
There was consultation. I would say that there wasn't enough consultation. So we had an advisory group of autistic people of about 12 people. It turns out for a study of that kind and that scale, we probably needed to have consulted much more widely to really hear those concerns. But I suppose for some people, even just the word genetics is a trigger.
Sure.
What are these scientists going to do with our DNA, and are they trying to eradicate us? And anyone who knows me knows that is not my agenda, that's not my values, but that's the kind of anxiety that was triggered even by just announcing a study involving genetics. So you do need to have dialogue with autistic people and the scientists. It's really important that there's trust between those two communities. And increasingly, there are a lot of autistic people who are autism researchers.
Yes.
So there's a kind of overlap between those in those communities.
On a 1 to 100% scale, how much do you think we know about autism?
I would say that we're still scratching the surface, actually. So, science proceeds very slowly over time. We've talked about what have we learned in the last 40 years, but I think we should take the long perspective. New technologies are going to come along that are going to help us understand autism. new perspectives will come along, particularly from autistic people. I think we've learned quite a lot compared to 40 years ago. I mean, if you want a number, I'm very happy to agree that it's a small number. It could be 10 or 20% of what we could be learning. What I've noticed in the research world, autism research, is that over the period we've talked about, there was the creation of an international society for autism research, and that's grown decade by decade. So there's a conference that's now held every May internationally. It's kind of a world international conference where 2,000 autism researchers gather in a conference center to exchange latest research. You get the idea that this is a field that is rapidly growing, lots of new findings coming out. And so the more funding and the more scientists who are involved in this enterprise of trying to understand autism and what autistic people need, the more we're going to learn.
If I sort of summarize a bit on what I've heard, there's been all of this work going on for the last 40 years. There's been big changes actually in perception and understanding. And yet, to quote some stats back to you, 8 out of 10 autistic adults are unemployed. Suicide is the second leading cause of death for autistics. It's suggested 94% of autistic children are bullied, and over 200,000 people are on the NHS autism assessment waiting list. What the is going on?
So these are very depressing statistics. Let's take them one at a time. So the National Autistic Society in this country reckon 85% of autistic adults are unemployed, so only 15% in employment. I think the Office of National Statistics puts it at around 20% of autistic adults are in paid employment. So that's unacceptably low. Unemployment is not good for your mental health. Unemployment kind of takes away your opportunity for autonomy, having money in your pocket, independence from your parents as you grow up. So that's got to be addressed. We've got to find out what the barriers to employment are for autistic people. I think you talked about mental health, that something like 8 out of 10 autistic people are not only autistic, but they also have depression or anxiety. And you could sort of see that's likely to be secondary to not getting the right support. That autistic people are not born depressed or anxious, but if they've had the experience of bullying that you talked about, our own research has looked at some of these, we call them vulnerability factors. Have you ever experienced things like bullying and discrimination and stigma? That can lead to a child or a teenager who's got low self-confidence, low self-esteem, depression, maybe underachieving at school. So we need much better support much earlier for autistic people. Just one more statistic that you mentioned, which is about suicide rates. This is very worrying. We were the first group to look at suicidality, it's called, in autistic people. So we looked at people coming to our clinic. I mentioned earlier the clinic that we created, where we'd ask people, have you ever planned or attempted suicide or felt suicidal? Those were the 3 questions. I think what we found, this was published in 2014, was that 2/3 of autistic adults had felt suicidal and 1 in 3 had planned or attempted suicide. This is really scary stuff. Much higher than the general population. And that's subsequently been confirmed in other people's studies. So we've now got a research team looking at suicide prevention, looking at the risk factors, but also the protective factors to see if we can bring that rate down. So the research has got to be kind of focused on what can we do to improve autistic people's lives. Improve opportunities, improve better support.
What about this assessment waiting list?
The waiting list, so you did mention that, and that's probably a crisis in funding in the NHS. So, for example, the clinic that we set up has 1 full-time clinician to serve a population of Cambridgeshire and Peterborough for adults who think they might be autistic. So very quickly the waiting list builds up. And whilst people are waiting on the waiting list, they're not getting support. They're not even getting a diagnosis. So that's just exacerbating the mental health crisis. So I think that's a funding issue that the NHS has to decide to increase the number of clinicians.
Are there enough people training and wanting to be clinicians?
I think if the funding was there, if there were posts available, people would get trained and would fill those posts. But there may be that we need other models for how to cut those waiting lists. But certainly that's a big concern.
I'd like to talk about comorbidities. I'm interested by how, from being very new to all this and the outside looking in, and I was talking with Amanda Kirby about this,
right?
How it can be very neurotype silos, and we're only focused on autism assessment or dyslexia assessment or ADHD assessment.
Yeah.
And yet there is evidence that it seems more typical that for neurodivergent people that there is overlap and there are co-occurring conditions.
Yeah.
Where does that idea come into your work and thinking?
I mean, it's just a fact that autistic people often don't just meet the criteria for autism, but they might also meet the criteria for another disability like ADHD. I think it may be something as high as 50% of autistic people also have ADHD. And then there are other neurodiverse diagnoses, shall we say, like dyslexia, dyspraxia, and so on. So I think that means that the people doing the assessments need to have quite a wide lens. They're not just looking for autism. They should look for this kind of broader picture. Because if you're going to offer support, it needs to be tailored to the individual, but it has to meet all of their needs, not just some of them.
Is there research going on around this co-occurrence? Because it feels very siloed.
Research is going on into it, whether it's psychological research or genetics research. We've talked about that quite a lot. Why is it that some autistic people have more than one disability? What's the best way to meet their needs? So I think the research is taking a broader view, but whether that's reaching families and individuals, I think that's very different.
What are the questions that you would like to answer about autism? You said, Simon, obviously we don't know, maybe 10 to 20%. What do you think are the three key questions that we need to know or that you'd like to know?
I suppose what I'd like to know is, well, if we take those suicide statistics that are the most worrying, I'd say, we could turn it the other way around and say 1 in 3 autistic adults are not planning or attempting suicide. So what is working for them? Or if you take the statistic about mental health, we talked about 8 out of 10 autistic people have depression or anxiety. So that means that 2 out of 10 don't. 1 in 5 are doing okay. Their mental health is okay. So I think we need to be focusing on the autistic children and adults who are managing and understand more about what's gone well for them in their lives so that they're fulfilling their potential. Because those are the people we can learn from. They might be able to help us understand what the other autistic people are not receiving and should be receiving.
The suicide one is very close to home for me, but also when, not that they're necessarily connected, but understanding that autistic people live to be 16 years younger than the average age that people die. Yeah, it's pretty worrying too.
It is. And so when I talked earlier about our research focused on autistic people's health, the mortality sort of statistics are partly what's driven us to look at this, that autistic people are living shorter lives on average. There's new research questioning exactly what the difference is, but certainly there's that inequality. And we need to understand suicide is part of it, epilepsy is part of it, but lifestyle factors might be another one. So it's really just trying to understand what can we do to improve autistic people's health so that they live the same length of life as anyone else.
How much do we know beyond genetics about the biological makeup of autistic bodies?
Not enough.
You've got a lot of work to do, Simon.
There is, but I'm looking forward to it. This is why when you asked earlier about how much do we know, there's still a lot more to learn.
And I guess that's what maintains your interest.
The research is there to serve the autism community and their families. And we've got to make sure that that's always true. So we can do that by talking to autistic people, making sure they're included in the research. They're even co-designing the research with the scientists,
Yeah.
keeping the research relevant
Mm.
to autistic people's lives. Ultimately, we want happy autistic people, so their well-being needs to be improved, healthy autistic people, and autistic people who are fulfilling their potential educationally and in the workplace. So we know that there are huge inequalities at the moment.
Mm.
At the point when we can say those inequalities are negligible, we'll feel that the research and the kind of policy work that flows from research has done its job.
Yeah. I wanted to sort of, as we start to wrap up, and obviously we talked about problems and difficulties and challenges. I wanted to end on talking about your book, The Pattern Seekers.
Right.
I have that book in my own small way, and I guess some of my family's background. I subscribe to a lot of the thinking.
Right.
And I am an example, I guess, of a pattern seeker and an inventor and someone who's disrupted something or changed something.
Right. Can you tell me a little bit more about in what way?
Yeah. So within my family background, on both sides of my family, inventors and engineers.
Right.
And inventors connected to agriculture and engineering, and inventors connected to telecommunications and electricity and microphones and
lots of talent in your family.
Well,
on both sides.
I'm sort of piecing it together.
Right.
My piece was inventing a way to distill spirits that were not alcoholic.
Okay.
So distilled non-alcoholic spirits. I launched the first one in 2015, and I've just also figured out a way to mature non-alcoholic liquids using wood to make a non-alcoholic product without barrels. Why is there a seeming propensity in autistic traits towards being good at pattern recognition and invention?
Yeah. So that was the topic of my last book, The Pattern Seekers, and it came out of research that we'd done. So back in the late 90s, we'd found that if you look at autistic people, if you go back one generation and look at their fathers or grandfathers, they were more likely to work in the field of engineering. And that was true on both sides of the family. So we thought that could be potentially a genetic thing, that previous generations where there's an autistic child were showing talent in understanding systems. Engineering is a good example of systems thinking. We didn't look at the mothers because not enough of them were working outside of the home to know what fields they would have gone into. But certainly you could see on their fathers and grandfathers on both sides of the family, there was that kind of link. We then did this study in 2012, looking at the city of Eindhoven, which is in the Netherlands, which attracts a lot of people who are good at technology because it's had the Philips factory there for 100 years. It's had the Institute of Technology there, just kind of attracting people who kind of work in IT or engineering. And we found that rates of autism were twice as high in Eindhoven compared to two other Dutch cities we looked at that didn't have this kind of focus on technology. So again, we kind of surmised that maybe autism occurs in families where there's this kind of genetic aptitude for understanding patterns and systems, and that maybe that would give us a clue to how we should understand autistic people. That autistic people may have social difficulties, that's kind of how they get their diagnosis, but they may also have strengths in pattern recognition and systems thinking. And so we had the opportunity, I think it was in 2017, to test this in terms of the molecular genetics, because we worked with a company called 23andMe. So it's a personal genomics company where you pay $100 and you get some feedback on, you send your saliva to the company and they tell you what genes you're carrying. But customers of that company also took the systemizing quotient. So we could look at how much they're interested in systems of one kind or another. And with colleagues who are geneticists, I'm not one, I'm a psychologist, but we were able to identify the common genetic variants associated with systemizing and see whether there was any overlap with the common genetic variants in autism. and found there was a significant overlap.
Okay.
So some of the same genes that contribute to autism are also contributing to talent at pattern recognition. It's kind of in the DNA. And so I reported it in that book. I mean, it's obviously sort of reported in scientific publications too, but it was kind of I think it was changing our view of autism away from this idea of autism as a disorder or autism as a disease. It's just really showing autism as a difference. And some of those differences involve aptitude in understanding patterns and systems. And in the book, I argued that autistic people played a central role in human invention. So, your family is quite a nice example. Even you are a nice example of individuals who think differently, want to try and understand how to fine-tune or kind of improve a technology or a tool that they're using to make progress. That view of autism, that it's just part of the diversity of human beings, that we're not just all doing the same thing over and over again, but we're looking for new ways to do things, to optimize things. I think it's a different way of looking at autistic people.
Was there any controversy with that book?
Not that I'm aware of. I mean, I think it's been quite well received, almost as a celebration of autistic people and a kind of shift in our perception of autism.
We're very keen that one of the biggest lacking aspects and missing components of people's understanding of neurodiversity has been the lack of role models.
Yeah.
And we all know who we grew up seeing and idolizing and heroes.
Right.
And we know that, well, if you don't see people like you and you don't have those people to aspire to be like, that can have a really negative impact, I guess, on people's esteem and worth. There are lots of great examples throughout history, not just from a invention engineer perspective, scientific discovery side, but whether that's authors, artists.
Absolutely.
And so that role model piece for future generations, we think is really important. That there's that representation that children can see Lewis Capaldi or Billie Eilish and kind of go, oh, well, I've got Tourette's and so do they. And wow, that's...
Absolutely. And I think that plays a really important role, I think, in several ways. So one is just the identification that you're talking about, that this person is just like me, and also kind of demonstrating that people have made it to some level, but also just destigmatizing disabilities like autism or differences like autism or Tourette's or whichever one it is.
Where do you hope we'll be, Simon, in 10 years' time with autism?
Yeah, I would hope that society will have moved on as a result of podcasts like yours, but also just kind of wider shifts in society towards greater inclusion. So I would say that where we're seeing the worrying high rates of poor mental health in autistic people, I would hope that that needle will have shifted so that autistic people are feeling more included in every aspect of our world, but particularly at school.
Yeah.
If attitudes amongst other kids and amongst teachers are changing, so that children are having a happier childhood in school. It's their one chance at education.
Yeah.
If they're not experiencing bullying, which is toxic for self-confidence, I would hope that we would be seeing a more inclusive world.
Yeah. I've just looked at the clock and we've been speaking for an hour and a half.
Okay.
And I've really enjoyed talking to you.
Me
because
too.
I've really enjoyed being able to ask lots of questions that I've wanted to ask.
Good.
Both for my own selfish understanding, but also for our audience as well. I felt it was important to give you the space to be able to explain things.
I'm grateful to you for inviting me. I've enjoyed our conversation too, and it has been quite broad-ranging. Conversations like ours will hopefully help other people to understand how important it is that we improve the world for autistic people.
Yeah. The last piece, Simon, is we have these green dot badges.
Yeah.
They're a bit of a green light and sort of symbol of support. I have one for you But I'd also like to give you another one
Okay.
and ask you who you would like to give that to.
I will wear it with pride. And if you're giving me one to give to somebody else, I suppose it'd be nice to give it to someone who's kind of in the public focus. So it would be quite nice to give it to someone who's maybe a politician.
Mm-hmm. Who do you have in mind?
Well,
Amanda's already given one to Keir Starmer.
Good. Once you explain what it represents, if people are wearing it openly, it's just a reminder to other people. So, I think we're lucky that we've got an all-party parliamentary group for autism. So the person I'd like to give it to would be Marie Tidball, who's the chair of the all-party parliamentary group for autism.
Amazing. Thank you, Simon.
Thank you.